The bustling chatter of the Copper Kettle Diner ebbed and flowed like waves lapping at a shore. It was a cozy establishment, nestled in the heart of a small town in Virginia, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sizzle of bacon on the griddle. The lunch rush was in full swing, with patrons from all walks of life seeking refuge from the sweltering summer heat outside. Among the diners sat Marcus Holloway, a 35-year-old investment banker from New York City, who found himself in this quaint eatery due to a canceled flight. His crisp suit and polished demeanor stood out among the casual attire of the locals. Marcus tapped his foot impatiently, his eyes darting between his Rolex watch and the elderly gentleman seated a few tables away. The old man, who appeared to be in his late 80s, wore a neatly pressed uniform that seemed to belong to a bygone era. His weathered hands cradled a steaming mug of coffee, and his eyes, though clouded with age, sparkled with a hint of mischief as he observed the bustling diner. Marcus's lip curled in disdain as he watched the old man. "Can you believe this guy?" he muttered to no one in particular, loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. "Who does he think he's fooling with that getup?" A few heads turned, curious about the source of the sudden outburst. Marcus, emboldened by the attention, continued his tirade. "I mean, come on. It's not even Veterans Day. What's with a costume party?" The elderly gentleman seemed oblivious to the commotion, his focus entirely on savoring his coffee and occasionally glancing out the window at the town square beyond. His calm demeanor only served to irritate Marcus further. "Hey, Grandpa," Marcus called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you get lost on your way to the Civil War reenactment?" A hush fell over the nearby tables. The waitress, a kind-faced woman named Betty, approached Marcus with a concerned expression. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your voice down. We don't tolerate." But Marcus was on a roll. He waved Betty away dismissively. "Oh, come on. I'm just having a little fun. Don't tell me you all buy into this charade." The old man finally turned his gaze toward Marcus, offering a gentle smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. This unexpected response threw Marcus off balance for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his frustration mounting. "What's the matter, old-timer? Cat got your tongue?" Marcus sneered. "Or are you just pretending to be hard of hearing to go along with your little act?" The diner had grown eerily quiet now, save for the soft clink of silverware and the low hum of the air conditioning. All eyes were on the unfolding drama, a mix of discomfort and anticipation hanging in the air. Betty, the waitress, tried once more to intervene. "Sir, please. That's enough. If you can't control yourself, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave." Marcus scoffed, his face flushed with a combination of heat and indignation. "Leave? I haven't even gotten my food yet. Besides, I'm not the one causing a scene here. It's this guy, parading around in his Halloween costume in the middle of July." He stood up, gesturing wildly at the elderly man. "Come on, folks. Are we really going to let this slide? He's clearly just fishing for attention, maybe hoping for a free meal or some pats on the back for a war he probably wasn't even alive for." The old man's smile never wavered, but a flicker of sadness passed through his eyes. He reached for his cane, slowly rising to his feet with a grace that belied his advanced years. Marcus, sensing he might have gone too far but unwilling to back down, pressed on. "Oh, now he's going to show us his war wound, right? Probably stub his toe on purpose for dramatic effect." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the diner. A few patrons stood up, ready to intervene if necessary. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Betty stepped between Marcus and the old man, her voice firm. "That's quite enough, sir. I'm going to have to insist that you leave now." Marcus, realizing he had lost his audience, attempted to salvage the situation. Fine. I'm going. But mark my words, this guy's nothing but a fraud. A relic trying to relive his glory days, if he even had any." As he gathered his things, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had miscalculated badly. The looks of disgust and disappointment on the faces around him began to chip away at his bravado. But pride prevented him from backing down or apologizing. With a final huff, he stormed toward the exit, muttering under his breath about small-town mentalities and gullible fools. As he reached for the door handle, he cast one last glance at the old man, who was now surrounded by concerned patrons offering words of comfort. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the diner. The old man's gaze held no anger, no resentment, only a profound sadness that seemed to pierce right through Marcus's carefully constructed facade of superiority. As the door swung shut behind him, Marcus couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. But it was too late now. The damage was done, and the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he could never have anticipated. The bell above the diner's door chimed as Marcus exited, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence. The elderly gentleman, seemingly unperturbed by the outburst, slowly lowered himself back into his seat. His movements were deliberate, each motion infused with a dignity that spoke of years of discipline and self-control. As the initial shock of the confrontation began to dissipate, the diner's patrons found themselves drawn to the old man's calm demeanor. His weathered hands returned to their place around the coffee mug, steam still rising in lazy curls. The ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere that lingered in the air. Betty, the waitress, approached his table with concern etched across her face. "Are you all right, sir?"
I'm so sorry about that awful man.
"Can I get you anything?" The old man looked up at her, his eyes twinkling with a warmth that seemed to melt away some of the tension in the room. "I'm just fine, young lady."
Don't you worry about me.
"I've weathered far worse storms than a bit of hot air from a misguided young man." His voice, though soft, carried a strength that belied his advanced years. It was the voice of someone who had seen the world at its worst and its best, and had chosen to embrace the latter. As Betty nodded and moved away, other patrons began to whisper among themselves. The incident had stirred something in the collective consciousness of the diner, a mix of shame at having witnessed such disrespect and admiration for the dignified response. A middle-aged woman at a nearby table leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't believe that man's behavior. Who does he think he is?" Her companion, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, shook his head. "It's a shame. Young people these days have no respect for their elders, let alone for veterans." The whispers continued to ripple through the diner, a current of indignation and curiosity. Some patrons cast furtive glances at the old man, trying to discern more about him without being obvious. Meanwhile, the subject of their attention seemed content to sip his coffee and gaze out the window, his eyes focused on something beyond the confines of the diner. There was a faraway look in his eyes, as if the commotion had stirred memories long buried. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he stage whispered, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Why is that man wearing uniform? Is he a soldier?" The mother, embarrassed by her son's lack of volume control, tried to shush him. But the old man turned towards them, his smile growing wider. "It's quite all right, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily across the now quiet diner. "Curiosity is a virtue in the young. To answer your question, young man, I was indeed a soldier, many years ago." The boy's eyes widened with wonder. "Were you in a war? Did you fight bad guys?" A shadow passed over the old man's face, quick as a summer cloud. "I serve my country, yes. But war isn't about fighting bad guys, son. It's about protecting what's good and right in the world." This exchange seemed to break the spell of silence that had fallen over the diner. Slowly, conversation resumed, though many eyes remained fixed on the elderly veteran. Betty returned to his table, this time with a slice of apple pie. "On the house," she said with a warm smile. "It's the least we can do after, well, you know." The old man's eyes crinkled with genuine appreciation. "That's very kind of you, miss. But there's no need to make amends for something you didn't do. The actions of one man don't reflect on this fine establishment or its patrons." As he spoke, the door to the diner swung open again. Marcus stood there, his face a storm cloud of emotions, anger, embarrassment, and a growing sense of unease. He had circled the block several times, his conscience warring with his pride. The diner fell silent once more as Marcus took a tentative step inside. All eyes turned to him, a mix of curiosity and hostility in their gazes. But the old man in the uniform didn't turn. He remained focused on his pie, taking small, measured bites as if he had all the time in the world. Marcus cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet diner. I think I left my phone, he muttered, his eyes darting around, refusing to settle on the old man or meet the stares of the other patrons. Betty approached him, her posture stiff. I haven't seen any phone, sir. Perhaps you'd like to check your table? Marcus nodded, his movements jerky as he made his way back to his former seat. He made a show of looking under the table and checking the bench, all the while acutely aware of the disapproving gazes following his every move. As he straightened up, his eyes inadvertently met those of the elderly veteran. The old man's gaze held no anger, no accusation, only a calm acceptance that made Marcus's stomach churn with guilt. Unable to bear the weight of that gaze, Marcus turned away. I must have left it in the car, he mumbled, already backing towards the door. Just as he reached for the handle, the old man's voice rang out, clear and strong. Young man, he called, causing Marcus to freeze in his tracks. You forgot something else. Marcus turned slowly, his face a mask of confusion and dread. The old man smiled gently, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. You forgot to finish your lunch. Why don't you join me? I'd be happy to share this excellent pie. The invitation hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was more than an offer of dessert. It was an opportunity for redemption, a chance to bridge the chasm that Marcus had created with his thoughtless words. For a long moment, Marcus stood frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the pull of something he couldn't quite name. The diner held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In that suspended moment, the true measure of both men, the young banker and the elderly veteran, was about to be revealed. And with it, a lesson in humility, respect, and the enduring power of forgiveness was poised to unfold in the most unexpected of places, a small-town diner on a sweltering summer day. The seconds stretched into an eternity as Marcus stood, frozen in indecision. The old man's invitation hung in the air, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. With a barely perceptible nod, Marcus found himself moving towards the table, his legs carrying him forward almost of their own accord. As he sank into the chair opposite the elderly veteran, the tension in the diner seemed to shift. Whispered conversations resumed, the clink of cutlery against plates providing a gentle backdrop to the unfolding scene. Thank you, Marcus mumbled, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. The words felt foreign on his tongue, weighted with more than just gratitude for the invitation. The old man's smile never wavered. Think nothing of it, son. Now, how about we start over? I'm Frank Pearson. Marcus, came the reply, barely above a whisper. Marcus Holloway. Frank nodded, as if committing the name to memory. Well, Marcus, what brings you to our little corner of Virginia? You seem a bit far from Wall Street. Marcus looked up, surprise etched across his features. How did you? A soft chuckle escaped Frank's lips. The suit, the watch, the impatience. I may be old, but I'm not blind. Plus, I spent a few years in New York myself back in the day. As Frank spoke, he shifted in his seat, causing his jacket to fall open slightly. The movement revealed a flash of metal, a row of ribbons and medals pinned to the inside of his uniform jacket. Marcus's eyes were drawn to them, curiosity momentarily overriding his embarrassment. Frank noticed the younger man's gaze and smiled. I see you've spotted my little collection. Would you like to know about them? Before Marcus could respond, Frank began to unbutton his jacket. As he carefully laid it open on the table, a collective gasp rippled through the diner. The inside of the jacket was a tapestry of military history, adorned with rows of ribbons, medals, and insignia that spoke of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. Marcus leaned in, his eyes wide. Among the array of decorations, one stood out, a small, unassuming medal that seemed to glow with an inner light. It was the Medal of Honor, the highest and most prestigious military decoration presented to members of the United States Armed Forces. Is that? Marcus began, his voice trailing off in awe. Frank nodded, his eyes taking on a faraway look. The Medal of Honor, yes. But you know, it's not about the medal. It's about what it represents. The men I served with, the ones who didn't come home. The diner had fallen silent once more, all eyes and ears focused on Frank as he began to speak. His voice, though soft, carried easily in the hushed room. It was during the Korean War, Frank began, his fingers lightly tracing the contours of the medal. I was just a young lieutenant then, not much older than you are now, Marcus. We were pinned down in the Chosin Reservoir, surrounded by enemy forces in the bitter cold of December 1950. As Frank spoke, the diner seemed to fade away. In its place, the harsh landscape of Korea materialized, snow-covered mountains, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the bone-chilling cold that seeped into every crevice. Our company was tasked with holding a crucial hill, Frank continued, his eyes focused on something only he could see. The enemy attacks were relentless. Wave after wave, they came. We were running low on ammunition, food, and hope. The cold was our worst enemy. It got into your bones, made your fingers so numb you could barely pull a trigger. Marcus leaned in, captivated by the vivid description. The bustling diner seemed to fade away, replaced by the stark, unforgiving landscape of war-torn Korea. On the third night, Frank went on, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We got word that a group of wounded Marines was stranded in a valley just beyond our position. Command couldn't spare any men for a rescue mission. It was deemed too risky. He paused, taking a sip of his now cold coffee. The entire diner held its breath, waiting for him to continue. I couldn't just leave them there, Frank said, his eyes meeting Marcus's. Those were our boys out there, freezing and bleeding. So I volunteered to lead a small team to get them out. Frank's weathered hands trembled slightly as he recounted the events of that fateful night. We moved out under the cover of darkness. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind cut like a knife. We could hear the enemy patrols, their voices carried on the wind. One wrong step, one cough, and we'd all be dead. The patrons of the diner listened in rapt attention, their food forgotten. Even Betty, the waitress, stood motionless, coffee pot in hand, completely engrossed in Frank's tale. We found the Marines huddled in a small cave, Frank continued. Half of them were too injured to walk. We had to carry them on our backs, through enemy territory, in sub-zero temperatures. Every step was agony, every breath a struggle. Marcus found himself holding his breath, his earlier arrogance forgotten in the face of Frank's humbling narrative. About halfway back to our lines, we were spotted. Frank's voice grew hoarse with emotion. The night lit up with gunfire. I ordered my men to keep moving with the wounded while I stayed behind to provide cover. Frank's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he recalled the events. I don't know how long I held that position. Minutes, hours. It all blurred together. I just knew I had to give my men enough time to get those wounded Marines to safety. He touched the Medal of Honor gently. They say I took out an entire enemy platoon that night. Honestly, I don't remember much of it. All I know is that when dawn broke, I was still there, half frozen and nearly out of ammo, but alive. And my men had made it back, with the wounded. The diner remained silent, the weight of Frank's words hanging in the air. Marcus struggled to find his voice, overwhelmed by the tale of bravery and sacrifice. How did you survive? He finally managed to ask. Frank smiled sadly. Luck, mostly. And the thought of my girl back home, my Maggie. She'd made me promise to come back, and I wasn't about to break that promise. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph of a beautiful young woman. We got married as soon as I got back. Spent 62 wonderful years together before she passed last spring. Marcus stared at the photo, then back at the medals. The enormity of his earlier behavior crashed over him like a wave. Here he was, having ridiculed a man who had faced death, endured unimaginable hardships, and sacrificed so much for his country and his comrades. Mr. Pearson, Marcus began, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry for my behavior earlier. I had no idea. Frank held up a hand, stopping Marcus mid-sentence. Son, you don't owe me an apology. You couldn't have known. But perhaps there's a lesson here for both of us. Both of us? Marcus asked, confused. Frank nodded, his eyes twinkling. You see, when I first saw you come in all swagger and impatience, I made assumptions too. I thought, here's another entitled young man who doesn't understand the value of a hard day's work or sacrifice. But that's not fair, is it? I don't know your story any more than you knew mine. Marcus sat back, stunned by Frank's words. The old veteran was right. They had both been quick to judge based on appearances and assumptions. The medal, the uniform, Frank continued, gesturing to his jacket. They're just symbols. What really matters is how we treat each other, how we face our challenges, and the legacy we leave behind. That's true whether you're a soldier on a battlefield or a banker on Wall Street. The diner had begun to buzz again with quiet conversation, but Marcus barely noticed. He was transfixed by Frank's words, feeling as if he was seeing the world through new eyes. Mr. Pearson, Marcus said, his voice firm with newfound respect. Would you tell me more? About your experiences, about what you've learned. I think I have a lot to learn from you. Frank's face broke into a wide smile. I'd be honored, Marcus. And please call me Frank. Now, why don't you tell me a bit about yourself? I'm sure you have some interesting stories of your own. As Marcus began to speak, hesitantly at first with growing confidence, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. What had begun as a scene of conflict had transformed into a moment of connection, understanding, and growth. The unlikely pair, the young Wall Street banker and the elderly war hero, continued their conversation, bridging generations and experiences. And in that small Virginia diner, on an ordinary summer day, an extraordinary lesson in humanity, respect, and the power of shared stories was unfolding. As Frank's story came to a close, a profound silence settled over the Copper Kettle Diner. It was not the uncomfortable quiet that had followed Marcus's earlier outburst, but rather a reverent hush, heavy with respect and introspection. The clink of cutlery against plates had ceased, the soft murmur of conversation had faded, and even the sizzle from the kitchen seemed muted, as if the very building itself was paying homage to the veteran's tale. Marcus sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Frank's weathered hands as they rested on the table. Those hands, once young and strong, had carried wounded comrades through enemy territory, had pulled triggers to save lives, had held the love of his life for over 6 decades. Now, they told a story of their own, a story of time past, of hardships endured, and of a life fully lived. The young banker's mind reeled as he tried to reconcile the man before him with the caricature he had so callously mocked earlier. The shame of his actions sat like a lead weight in his stomach, but mingled with it was a growing sense of awe and respect. Around them, the other patrons of the diner remained frozen in place, caught in the spell of Frank's narrative. A mother held her young son close, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. An elderly couple at a nearby booth clasped hands tightly, perhaps remembering their own trials from years past. Even the cook had emerged from the kitchen, his apron stained and his brow sweaty, standing in respectful silence at the counter. Betty, the waitress, moved silently among the tables, refilling coffee cups with a practiced hand. As she approached Frank and Marcus's table, she paused, her eyes meeting Frank's. No words were exchanged, but volumes were spoken in that glance. Gratitude, respect, and a deep, abiding sadness for the sacrifices of a generation. The silence stretched on, each person in the diner lost in their own thoughts. Some reflected on their own family histories, grandfathers, fathers, uncles who had served. Others contemplated the nature of sacrifice and duty, and more than a few found themselves reevaluating their own prejudices and assumptions. Marcus, for his part, felt as if he was seeing the world through new eyes. The priorities that had seemed so important just hours ago, closing deals, making money, climbing the corporate ladder, suddenly felt hollow and insignificant in the face of Frank's quiet heroism. He opened his mouth to speak, but found he had no words. What could he possibly say that would adequately express the turmoil of emotions swirling within him? How could he articulate the profound shift in perspective he was experiencing? Frank seemed to sense Marcus's internal struggle. With a gentleness that belied his military background, he reached across the table and patted the younger man's hand. "It's all right, son," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow filling the entire diner. "Sometimes, silence says more than words ever could." Marcus nodded, grateful for Frank's understanding. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself, to process the magnitude of what he had just heard and the lesson he had been taught. As if on cue, a gentle breeze wafted through the diner as someone opened the door. The spell was broken, and life began to stir once more. Conversations resumed, but in hushed, respectful tones. The cook returned to his grill, and the sounds of the kitchen gradually filled the air. Yet, there was a tangible change in the atmosphere. The patrons moved with a new awareness, casting glances of admiration and gratitude towards Frank. Those seated near him seemed to sit a little straighter, as if proximity to such a hero demanded their best posture. Marcus, still struggling to find his voice, noticed a young woman approaching their table. She couldn't have been more than 20, with bright eyes that spoke of dreams yet unfulfilled. In her hands, she clutched a small notebook and pen. "Excuse me, sir," she said, addressing Frank with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "I'm a student at the local community college, studying journalism. Would you mind if I interviewed you sometime? Your story, it's important. It needs to be heard." Frank's eyes crinkled with a warm smile. "Well now, young lady, I'm not sure my old tales are worth much ink. But if you think they might be of interest, I'd be happy to chat with you." The young woman's face lit up with excitement. "Thank you, sir. It would be an honor." As she turned to leave, Frank called out to her. "On one condition, though." She paused, looking back inquiringly. Frank gestured towards Marcus. "Make sure you interview this young man, too. I have a feeling his story might surprise you." Marcus looked up, startled. "Me? But I haven't done anything worth." "Everyone has a story, Marcus," Frank interrupted gently. "And sometimes, the most powerful tales are about how we grow and change. Your journey here today, from where you started to where you are now, that's a story worth telling." The young journalist nodded enthusiastically, jotting something in her notebook before hurrying away, leaving Marcus to ponder Frank's words. As the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the heavy silence transformed into something else, a shared understanding, a collective appreciation for the complexities of human experience. The air hummed with unspoken connections, bridging generations, backgrounds, and perspectives. In that moment, the Copper Kettle Diner was more than just a small-town eatery. It had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where stories were shared, lessons were learned, and the true measure of a person was revealed not by their mistakes, but by their capacity for growth and understanding. Marcus, still processing the events of the day, found himself filled with a new sense of purpose. He had come to this town by chance, a detour on what he thought was his predestined path. Now, he realized this detour might just be the most important journey of his life. As the diner settled back into its routine, Marcus found his gaze drawn once again to the row of medals adorning Frank's uniform jacket. The Medal of Honor gleamed softly in the afternoon light filtering through the windows, its significance now weighing heavily on Marcus's mind. "Frank," Marcus began, his voice low and respectful, Would you mind telling me more about that night? The night you earned the Medal of Honor?" Frank's eyes, which had been twinkling with warmth, took on a more somber cast. He was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as if looking back through the decades to that cold Korean night. "You have to understand, Marcus," he began slowly, "that medal isn't just about me. It's about every man in my unit, every soldier who fought alongside us, and especially those who didn't make it home." Marcus nodded, listening intently as Frank continued. "It was December 1950, during the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. We called it the Frozen Chosin. The temperatures dropped to 30 below zero some nights. Men's weapons would freeze up, the lubricants turning to gel. We had to sleep with our boots in our sleeping bags to keep them from freezing solid. Frank paused, taking a sip of his coffee, which Betty had quietly refilled. The diner had grown quiet again, patrons listening surreptitiously to the veteran's tale. Our company was holding a strategic hill, crucial for the retreat of the 1st Marine Division. We were surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on everything: ammo, food, medical supplies. That's when we got word about a group of wounded Marines stranded in a valley about 2 miles from our position. Marcus leaned in, captivated by Frank's narrative. The bustling diner seemed to fade away, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving landscape of war-torn Korea. Command couldn't spare any men for a rescue op, said it was too risky. But I couldn't just leave those boys out there to die. So I volunteered to lead a small team. 5 of us set out that night. Me, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, Corporal Tom Henderson, and Privates Jimmy Liu and Carlos Ramirez. Frank's voice grew hushed, his words painting a vivid picture of that harrowing night. The wind was howling, snow blinding us. We could hear enemy patrols, their voices carried on the wind. One wrong step, one cough, and we'd all be dead. He described how they found the wounded Marines, 8 of them, huddled in a small cave, half frozen and barely alive. For couldn't walk at all. We had to carry them on our backs, Frank continued, his hands unconsciously mimicking the motion of hefting a body. Through enemy territory, in sub-zero temperatures. Every step was agony. Every breath a struggle. Marcus found himself holding his breath, completely engrossed in Frank's account. About halfway back to our lines, we were spotted. Frank's voice grew hoarse with emotion. The night lit up with gunfire. I ordered my men to keep moving with the wounded while I stayed behind to provide cover. Frank's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he recalled the events. I don't know how long I held that position. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. I just knew I had to give my men enough time to get those wounded Marines to safety. He touched the Medal of Honor gently. They say I took out an entire enemy platoon that night. Honestly, I don't remember much of it. All I know is that when dawn broke, I was still there, half frozen and nearly out of ammo, but alive. And my men had made it back, with the wounded. Marcus sat in awe, trying to imagine the courage and determination it must have taken to face such overwhelming odds. But here's the thing, Marcus, Frank said, leaning in, his voice intense. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to do my job, to bring my men home. The real heroes were the ones who didn't make it back. Men like Jimmy Liu, who used his body to shield a wounded Marine from enemy fire. Or Carlos Ramirez, who kept going even after taking a bullet to the leg, carrying a man twice his size to safety before collapsing from blood loss. Frank's eyes misted over as he spoke of his fallen comrades. Marcus sat in respectful silence, allowing the old veteran the time he needed to compose himself. You see, Marcus, Frank continued after a moment, his voice steadier now, that's what the Medal of Honor really represents. It's not just about one man's actions. It's about the collective courage and sacrifice of all those who serve. It's about the bonds forged in the crucible of combat, bonds that transcend time, race, and background. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the weight of what Frank was sharing. The medal wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of something far greater. After I was evacuated from Korea, Frank went on, I spent months in recovery. The frostbite had done a number on my feet and hands. There were times I thought I'd never walk again. But do you know what got me through it? Marcus shook his head, hanging on every word. Letters, Frank said, a small smile playing on his lips. Letters from the families of the men we saved that night. Mothers, wives, children, all writing to thank me for bringing their loved ones home. And letters from my own men, the ones who made it back with the wounded while I held off the enemy. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a weathered envelope. This one, he said, handling it with reverence, is from Mike O'Brien's daughter. She was born while he was overseas. Thanks to our mission that night, Mike got to meet her, to watch her grow up. She writes to me every year on the anniversary of that night, telling me about her life, her own children now. Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat as he watched Frank carefully return the letter to his jacket. When they told me I was to receive the Medal of Honor, my first thought was that I didn't deserve it, Frank admitted. How could I accept an honor when so many others had given so much more?
But then I realized it wasn't just for me.
It was for all of us, the ones who made it back and the ones who didn't. Frank's gaze became distant again, as if seeing beyond the walls of the diner. The day I received the medal, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would live a life worthy of the sacrifices made by my brothers in arms. That I would never forget the cost of freedom and the value of every human life. Marcus found himself deeply moved by Frank's words. The cynicism that had been such a part of his Wall Street persona seemed to melt away in the face of such genuine honor and humility. That's why I wear the uniform sometimes, even now, Frank explained, gesturing to his attire. Not for attention or glory, but as a reminder. A reminder to myself of the promises I made, and a reminder to others of the sacrifices made by so many for our country. He looked directly at Marcus, his gaze piercing. And that's why I didn't get angry at your words earlier, son. Because I realized that somewhere along the way, we've failed to pass on these stories, these lessons, to your generation. That's not your fault. It's ours. Marcus felt a mix of shame and gratitude wash over him. Frank, I don't know what to say. Thank you for sharing this with me, for teaching me. Frank reached across the table, patting Marcus's hand. Thank you for listening, son. That's all any of us old-timers really want, for our stories to be heard, for the sacrifices of our comrades to be remembered. As Frank spoke, Marcus noticed other patrons in the diner discreetly wiping away tears. The cook had emerged from the kitchen again, standing at the counter with his head bowed in respect. Betty, the waitress, stood nearby, coffee pot forgotten in her hand as she listened intently. You know, Frank said, a twinkle returning to his eye, there's a saying among Medal of Honor recipients. We don't wear the medal for ourselves. We wear it for those who can't. He gestured to the medal once more. This isn't my medal, Marcus. It belongs to Jimmy Lou, to Carlos Ramirez, to every man who fought and died on that frozen hill. I'm just its caretaker. Marcus nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. And by wearing it, by sharing your story, you're keeping their memory alive. Exactly, Frank said, a proud smile spreading across his face. You're a quick study, Marcus. I think you've learned more today than just the story behind an old medal. As their conversation continued, the atmosphere in the diner had transformed. What had begun as a scene of conflict had become a moment of profound learning and connection. Patrons who had been strangers mere hours ago now felt bonded by the shared experience of Frank's story. In that small Virginia diner, on what had seemed like an ordinary day, something extraordinary had occurred. A bridge had been built between generations, between civilian and military life, between the past and the present. And at the center of it all was a simple medal, its gold surface reflecting not just light, but the enduring values of courage, sacrifice, and honor. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the diner, Marcus realized that his unplanned detour had become the most important journey of his life. He had come seeking a quick meal and instead found a priceless lesson in humanity, respect, and the true meaning of heroism. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Copper Kettle Diner, the atmosphere had transformed into one of quiet reflection. The initial tension from Marcus's outburst seemed a lifetime ago, replaced by a sense of shared understanding and respect that permeated the small establishment. Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind reeling from the profound shift in perspective he had experienced over the past few hours. He glanced at his watch, suddenly remembering the world outside the diner. The missed flight, the important meeting in New York, the deals waiting to be closed. Surprisingly, none of it seemed to matter anymore. Frank, noticing Marcus's glance at his watch, smiled gently. I suppose you have places to be, son. Wall Street waits for no man, after all. Marcus shook his head, a rueful smile playing on his lips. You know, Frank, I think Wall Street can wait. I've learned more in this diner today than I have in years of board meetings and profit projections. Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. Is that so? And what exactly have you learned, if you don't mind my asking? Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was filled with a newfound conviction. I've learned about true courage, about sacrifice, about what really matters in life. I've learned that the measure of a person isn't in their bank account or their job title, but in how they treat others and the impact they have on the world around them. He looked around the diner, taking in the faces of the other patrons, the young journalist scribbling furiously in her notebook, the mother explaining in hushed tones to her curious son about the importance of veterans, the elderly couple holding hands and nodding in agreement with his words. I've learned, Marcus continued, that there are stories all around us, stories of bravery and hardship and perseverance, if we just take the time to listen. And I've learned that it's never too late to change, to become a better version of yourself. Frank nodded approvingly. Those are valuable lessons indeed, Marcus. But what do you plan to do with this newfound wisdom? Marcus straightened in his chair, a determined look in his eyes. Well, for starters, I'm going to call my boss and tell him I'm taking a week off. Then, if you're willing, Frank, I'd like to spend some time volunteering at the local VA hospital. I have a feeling there are a lot more stories I need to hear, a lot more lessons I need to learn. Frank's face broke into a wide grin. Well, I'll be damned. You really are full of surprises, aren't you, son? I'd be honored to introduce you to some of my old buddies at the VA. As they spoke, Betty approached their table, a nervous smile on her face. I'm sorry to interrupt, gentlemen, but, well, we have a bit of a situation. Frank and Marcus looked at her quizzically. You see, Betty continued, wringing her hands, word has spread about Mr. Pearson being here, about his story. There's quite a crowd gathering outside. People want to shake your hand, sir, to thank you for your service. Frank's eyes widened in surprise. Oh my, that wasn't my intention at all. I'm not one for big fuss and bother. Marcus stood up, a determined look on his face. Leave it to me, Frank. I think I can help. With a confidence born of years in high-pressure situations, albeit of a very different nature, Marcus strode to the diner's entrance. He opened the door to find a small crowd of townspeople gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and respect. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice carrying across the parking lot, I understand you're here to honor a true American hero, but I ask you to consider this. The man inside, Frank Pearson, didn't perform his acts of bravery for recognition or applause. He did it out of duty, out of love for his fellow soldiers and his country. The crowd listened intently as Marcus continued. The greatest honor we can give him, and all veterans like him, is not a handshake or a pat on the back. It's to live our lives in a way that's worthy of their sacrifice. To be kinder to one another, to serve our communities, to remember the cost of the freedoms we enjoy every day. He gestured towards the VA hospital visible in the distance. If you want to show your appreciation, consider volunteering at the VA. Listen to the stories of the veterans there. Help them in whatever way you can. That's how we truly honor heroes like Frank Pearson. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Slowly, people began to disperse, many with thoughtful expressions on their faces, some already making plans to visit the VA hospital. Marcus returned to the diner, where Frank was waiting with a look of gratitude and admiration. That was quite a speech, son. You missed your calling, should have been a politician. Marcus laughed, shaking his head. No, thank you. I think I found my true calling right here, learning from you, and others like you. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow through the diner windows, Frank and Marcus continued their conversation. They talked of war and peace, of loss and hope, of the past and the future. And in that small-town diner, an unlikely friendship was forged, a bridge between generations, a connection that would change both their lives in ways they had yet to fully understand. The other patrons, witnesses to this extraordinary encounter, found themselves changed as well. The young journalist had the story of a lifetime, but more importantly, a new perspective on the power of human resilience. The mother had a living history lesson to share with her son, a tangible example of the values she hoped to instill in him. The elderly couple felt a renewed appreciation for their own journey together, inspired by Frank's enduring love for his late wife. As the day drew to a close, the Copper Kettle Diner had become more than just a place to grab a meal. It had transformed into a crucible of human experience, a place where preconceptions were challenged, where stories were shared, and where the true meaning of heroism and respect was learned. Marcus, who had entered the diner as a brash, impatient Wall Street banker, left as a humbled and inspired individual, eager to make a positive impact on the world around him. Frank, who had come simply seeking a quiet meal, found himself reconnected with a sense of purpose, his stories and wisdom bridging the gap between generations. And as they parted ways that evening, with plans to meet again at the VA hospital, both men realized that sometimes the most unexpected detours in life can lead to the most important destinations. In the heart of small-town America, amidst the aroma of coffee and the clatter of plates, a simple encounter had blossomed into a profound lesson in humanity, respect, and the enduring power of shared stories.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.